I am Bill Huffman, and welcome to this week's episode of Who Killed Amy Mihaljevic. This podcast takes a deep dive into one of Cleveland's most infamous unsolved child murders. For any listeners who aren't familiar with this case, I implore you to check out episode 1 so you're not confused as we move forward. On this week's episode, we take things in a little different direction. Typically, we strictly talk about the Mihaljevic case, but this week, we are going to look at a case out of Canada that has striking similarities to Amy's abduction. So this week, I am joined in the studio with Nick from the True Crime Garage podcast to discuss the abduction and murder of one Alison Parrott. Nick will give you the nuts and bolts of this case, but I will say, the way she was abducted sounds a little too familiar. Both Alison and Amy were lured by a man who called them on the phone. The stories they used were different, but they were very close in age, Alison being 11 when she was abducted, while Amy was just a few weeks away from her 11th birthday. In this episode, we also break down our experience from CrimeCon 2019. So join me and Nick as we discuss the murder of Alison Parrott. Good morning, Nick. How's everything today?
Good morning, Bill. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Always a pleasure to have Nick from True Crime Garage here. And how are you recovering from your CrimeCon experience?
Very well. About 94% on the old health meter. But I seldom get above 96, so we're very close to running at full speed. I tell you what, this year's CrimeCon, and I'm not picking this because of the city or the venue or anything like that, but we talked about this on Off the Record a little bit. I've been to all 3 CrimeCons now, so there's been 3 of them. I've been to 3 of them. And very lucky to do so. It's awesome to meet the people that listen to our show and listen to all the other fantastic shows out there. The thing that was so amazing is watching how CrimeCon, the convention itself, grows not only in attendance, but also the experience and how they put it together. They're learning as they go, and you can really see these aren't baby steps from year 1 to 2 or 3. These are giant leaps that they're making in putting together this experience. I liken it to the first year felt a little more like a county fair, and this third year felt a little more like Disney World. So, I think they're definitely moving in the right direction. Everything's was very organized this year, very well laid out. Everything looked really great. I really enjoy that Podcast Row is growing as well. I think that's one of the, there's all these featured things to go to and presentations that you can go to that are just downright fantastic. However, I think Podcast Row is not only a big draw for CrimeCon, but it's an extra side dish for the people that are attending. And you saw how, people just turned out in Podcast Row in droves. And the only thing that doesn't work well for me, and this is just me being very selfish, is almost all of the presentations that I wanted to go to this year took place during Podcast Row. Now, one thing I will say that I told several people, because we get in these conversations and it's get to say hello to everybody and talk to everybody. But I said, they said the same thing. I feel like I missed this because I had to choose this over this. And I said, well, I have to be here at my little True Crime Garage table, and I'm missing this thing that I really wanted to meet Jeffrey Reinick, retired special agent with the FBI that we had on our show. He came on our show. He's been one of our best guests. And you know how much I love the FBI. So I spoke to him for hours and never got to meet him face to face every time he was doing. And he's not really an out there up front kind of dude. So I knew he'd probably limit himself to his obligations. And so those obligations he had a meet and greet and he had a presentation. And I missed both of those because they took place during Podcast Row. But anyway, when talking to the people that in attendance, the guests there, they had shared the same concern. But I quickly reminded them, look, I've been in plenty of fantastic things in my life and plenty of terrible things in my life. And my thought is always, I would rather there be way too much to do than not enough to do. You get so much bang for your buck at CrimeCon. And the city this year was fantastic. New Orleans is an experience in itself. I just, my heart swells for Nashville. So I loved Nashville last year, and I really loved the venue last year. And I'm looking forward to Orlando. Fingers crossed that they'll invite me back. I really ripped up the hotel room this year, so I'm not sure that that's going to happen. I went full Motley Crue on the hotel room.
Yeah, it was, being the first time that I'd been to CrimeCon and being invited to Podcast Row was, it was really cool. Definitely was awesome being stationed next to you guys, as well as Generation Y and Renner being right there. And I thought that was just very ideal for listeners and for the people that know that our shows kind of cross over every once in a while, where you're on my show, I'm on your show, or Renner, yada, yada, yada is all over, Who Killed Amy Mahalovic, as well as you are too. So I thought it was great for the listener, because they could go from, you just did a 2-parter on the case, on the Amy Mahalovic case, and then they can go, oh, what's this case? Who Killed Amy Mahalovic? And it was just like, it was really helpful as far as getting new people and, new eyes on the case, and hopefully, just more attention. And, I was passing out those postcards that basically are just the current flyers that the FBI has up on their website.
That was very smart of you. I thought, one, they look great, and it's a good little. It's a way to remind everybody about the case, bring awareness to your podcast, which is very detailed and very well done. And I'm with you, Bill. What I found most interesting about Podcast Row, about the setup of it, was clear to me the people in charge of setting up Podcast Row, they're not just some stiff suit somewhere. These are people that have listened to our shows, and they are aware of what's going on and how we've crossed over and teamed up. And everybody that's really been on our show before and on your show, we're all right around each other. So like you said, it made it easy for the people that wanted to come say hello to you, to Generation Y, to all the fantastic podcasters there. It had a great flow to it.
Yeah, it was I thought it was really a great experience. And you are dead, no pun intended, but you're dead right about the having stuff to do. I mean, it was literally, you looked at the schedule and it was, I want to go to the Iceman thing. I want to go to the Delphi murders thing. I want to go to the Dateline thing. I want to go to the, and there were all these different things that you could go to. But yeah, Podcast Row, I mean, we have obligations, that's what we're there for. It's our duty to, be there for the listeners, and I get that. But yeah, I thought the setup was awesome. I know that, the experience was just second to none. And, we did get to go to Bourbon Street one night, but, and then we had you guys had that meet and greet that Friday, and that was awesome. And the whole experience I thought was really cool. Hopefully, get invited again next year. But yeah, that was definitely a good experience. And Orlando seems like a really good place to have it as well. So hoping for the best for the next CrimeCon. But yeah, it definitely seemed like this year they were really pushing advocacy too. There was a lot of the events were open cases, unsolved cases, and this was my first year, so I'm not 100% sure if it's been like that every year. But I know that it felt like a lot of the podcasts and even just a lot of the presentations were about getting attention to certain cases, and that seems like it takes an event that could be misconstrued and makes it more of like we're providing a service and bringing attention to these cases that need to be solved and getting these people off the streets. So that was my impression of at least what the presentations were like.
And I do want to give a bit of a shout out here, if I could. You and I attended the Delphi murders presentation together. And that whole case, we don't need to get into it because we'll be here for a couple days. But I do want to really give big kudos to Kelsey Germain, or Kelsey German. I'm sorry. I always say Germain. We have a Germain dealership around here. So, but a big kudos to Kelsey German, the older sister of Liberty German, she was in attendance at CrimeCon and she participated in that talk about her sister's murder. So brave, such a brave young woman, and such a nice, sweet person. I've been fortunate enough to meet some of the other family members of the two young victims, and it just breaks your damn heart because these were such beautiful young girls from very good families, from very strong family oriented upbringing. And the one thing here is that we still have the families out fighting for these two, and they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop. And that gives me encouragement to keep doing what I'm doing, and you encouragement to keep doing what you're doing, and everybody listening out there to stay active and stay involved in the cases that anybody's passionate about.
And I think it helped give a little bit of perspective too on what it is that we do. And, we're podcasters and we provide stuff for people to listen to, and some people can say it's entertainment. I mean, it isn't, it's entertainment, but at the end of the day, there is still advocacy aspect to it where we're looking to we're not looking to solve, but bring attention to the cases that are, loom over certain communities, like the Mihalovic case, and, like the case. I mean, there's just so many cases that aren't solved that you guys cover, and that, the cases that are solved are interesting, but the unsolved cases, it does it helps that we have this podcast medium to bring attention to cases. And once it's out there, people can get on board and find out about it. And what happened in Australia, even, you could learn about just by opening up your podcast app. I mean, that's when I graduated college and, in journalism or whatever, it was a different, the internet was a different animal at the time. It was just not what it is today, and podcasting hadn't taken off. And I don't even think actually when I graduated, it was probably there. But in the last 10 years, though, in the last 5 years for sure, the podcast mediums made it more available for people to bring attention to cases. And I think that's just awesome. And I think the events like CrimeCon and, the true crime festivals and stuff like that, they just kind of keep, the proper attention on cases that need it. So that's just
and true crime podcast is infotainment. It's choose what you want. It could for some people it's news, it's history, it's entertainment, and then other people find a case and they choose to get involved, whether that be in an armchair detective web sleuthing role or in a more upfront boots on the ground role. And for the Delphi murders, one way that people can get involved is you can make a donation, $1, $5, $10, $20, $50, whatever you want. They are building a big park in Delphi, and this is going to be complete with softball fields, baseball fields, and this is going to be dedicated to these young girls that had their whole life ahead of them. And one thing is, this case will be solved eventually, and for us who want to see it to be solved, that chapter in our lives will be done and will be closed. but this park is going to be around for a long, long time. And it's not like they're just sitting there collecting money right now for this park. The park is in the process of being constructed. They are manipulating the land and setting things up so that they can start to put these things in. And I encourage anyone that wants to, if you go, you know what, I really feel like I should be involved in this Delphi murders case and I don't know how to, that's an easy way. That's an easy way. Open up your pocketbook. And I know it's everybody choose your own way how to spend your hard-earned money, but this is something you can feel good about at the end of the day. Make a contribution. Let's build a park for these girls and let's keep it around for a very long time. In a way, too, it starts to help the community to heal because that community is still very much hurting.
Yeah, especially when you have a small community of, I think they said there's 3,000 people in the city of Delphi. And, you know, during the press conference, obviously, they said, you know, we think you're hiding in plain sight. This park is also a constant reminder to that person or to the killers that they aren't going to give up. And I was really impressed with, you know, the one, the grandfather, I forget of which girl, but he, you know, his passion behind the project just, it was definitely palpable. And I thought it was really, it was impressive that they are able to put themselves out there without having really given anybody really all that much information about how they died or anything like that. We just have a sketch, some audio, and I mean, luckily we have that stuff because she was able to record it. But I don't know. I mean, that Delphi, the case itself is definitely one that's, you know, I think it will be solved sooner rather than later. I don't think it's going to be something that lingers on, but yeah, I thought that presentation was well done, and it was good to see that the state troopers were involved, and you know, it wasn't just I don't know, show and tell. Let's just put it
correct. Yeah,
it was helpful. So anything that keeps that case out there, and I think anybody that follows crime or true crime or, you know, things like this would definitely recognize that they aren't going to give up. And I think that's the same way with the Mahalovic case. And actually, we've talked about that in regards to the Mahalovic case. I was on the FBI's website yesterday, the Cleveland website. Second thing down is a picture of Amy. So it's like on their main homepage that they're, you know, seeking information on that case. And it's just like 30 years later, this is the front page of their website. That's kind of crazy, but at least it's good to know that they're keeping it out there.
Well, and I would recommend to them, you know, with the 30-year anniversary coming up of the abduction in October, I would recommend a presser, you know, do a press conference, even if it's a small one, because it's one that will go out on TV and internet. I would do one again on the anniversary of when she was found. Really, unless some new information comes about, other than people like you and I and documentarians, there's without these anniversaries, there's, you know, these are kind of placeholders for a reason to remind the public that it's unsolved and that we're still looking for this individual who we need your help, because the only thing that we know for certain about this guy is he's extremely dangerous and he's a murderer. I mean, so keep that in mind, even all these years later.
Right. And even if it's a one-off, this is a guy that's still could be living in the community, could be coaching kids soccer, could be involved in community, all sorts of stuff. But that's not the reason why we're actually here today. Today we're actually here to discuss a case that you brought to my attention that I thought was so interesting because of the similarities between, I mean, you have different similarities, but it's so interesting, the fact that the phone call, this girl was lured with a phone call, and the case that we're talking about is Alison Parrott from Toronto. And give a little background on that case if you've got a second.
Yeah, and I do want to mention real quick between you and me, and I didn't think about this till now, because really what linked Alison Parrot's case to Amy's case for me is the phone call, the aspect of the phone call. That's the ruse, that's the lure. And I actually just thought of another case here in Columbus where this would have been in the 70s that was instigated by a phone call. So I know that kind of throws a wrench in our whole little general thought about it, but
true. But as far as like time frames go, this case, the reason why I find this case to be interesting in regards to Amy's case is it would have happened only 3 years prior to Amy's. So that would have been more in the news and would have been something that somebody could have learned about.
In regards to the Columbus case that I just referenced, it's one of those cases that's as far as law enforcement's concerned, they've publicly said this is the individual that did it. He's dead. That's about as far as they could take it. In that case, the individual did know the victim, though, where what I think is fascinating about Alison Parrott and Amy Mahalovic, it's always been my strong belief that the offender did not really know the victim. And we know that to be true in Alison Parrott's case. So that's why it's fun to do these type of exercises to see. It's really about learning more about this type of offender and why he offends this way, and his modus operandi and how he chooses his victimology. A lot of that, if it is the same scenario where this individual does not really know Amy, just knows some little bits of information about her, because that's all this guy had with Alison Parrott. Those are things that we can learn from, and those are things that we need to study and take a look at. So I'll give you a rundown of the very basics of the details of Alison's case, and then we'll go through some of the other things that I think are very interesting about it. So at about 11 o'clock on the morning of July 25th, 1986, Alison Parrott received a phone call at her Summerhill Avenue home in Midtown Toronto. This is a male caller claiming to be a photographer. Now, this male caller asked Alison to meet him at the University of Toronto's Varsity Stadium, where he said he would be taking publicity photos of her and her teammates. Now, Alison, a member of the Tom Longboat Club, was to participate in an international track and field meet in Plainfield, New Jersey on August 1st, exactly 1 week later. She called her mother, Leslie, at work and got permission to attend this session.
Now, the thing about, she was only 11, but she was a runner, and so she had participated in a race that supposedly garnered her some attention, and basically she was in the paper. This guy must have read about her, looked her up in the phone book, or maybe knew, I mean, he couldn't have looked her up, but tried to go through the phone book and stumbled across the name. That part's interesting. I think I'd be interested to hear how he actually ended up choosing her, other than seeing her in the paper, like how he actually tracked her down, because it was 1986.
My general understanding of that, Bill, is that he was aware of her name and had seen her, and I believe it was he saw a photo of her with her name posted. So This case, even though they found her body just days later, it remained unsolved for a very long time. Now, the way I discovered this case was simply from reading one of John Douglas's books. The ironic thing here is this was not a case, being a Toronto case, this was not a case that Douglas investigated himself. He was up in Toronto doing some other work. And while there, a friend of his that was in law enforcement up in Toronto said, hey, could you come by and talk through this case with us? I'll provide you the case file and what we do know. And can you provide us a offender profile of the likely offender so that we can narrow down our suspect pool? The thing that I find fascinating about that, this is also very similar to Amy Mihaljevich's case, where the only offender profile I've ever seen in Amy's case is provided to us by Robert K. Ressler in his book, where under similar circumstances, he is in Ohio doing other work. He's contacted by individuals that he used to work with, special agents, and they say, hey, we got this horrible crime that took place. At the time, Amy was simply abducted and missing. Her body had not been found. So Dick Wren and John Dunn, special agents, they ask if Ressler could come to the Cleveland area and provide his expertise. And again, we will provide you with what we do know. Here's our case file. Can you provide us with an offender profile? And that's the only one that I've ever really seen in Amy's case. And it's very, we get really kind of the nuts and, the bare bones of the profile is what is, published in Ressler's book. And the bones of it are, they're looking for a white man, late 20s or early 30s, introverted, loner, relatively unsuccessful, unmarried, not overly educated, but not stupid, no military service, propensity for spending a lot of time with kids. That's kind of the bare bones of what that profile is. And that profile is, if anybody wants to read further, is in Whoever Fights Monsters by Robert K. Ressler. The thing here, though, we have a little more extensive of a profile. Because in Douglas's book, he gives us kind of every aspect of it. And if we have time, Bill, I'd like to go through that now.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what Douglas suspects is that it's a stranger abduction, and obviously at the time that he's putting together this profile, it's an unknown subject. The offender profile is as such: white male in his 30s, respectable looking, not threatening in appearance, could have a job that involves being around children. This could even be something indirect, may have had run-ins with the law, but more likely some vague complaints against him involving children, and no previous murder or violent crimes arrest. Some connection to photography, maybe just an avid amateur, a local rather than an outsider, and maybe a recreational hunter or fisherman. So let's try to figure out why Douglas comes up with these thoughts here, right? Okay. Some of this is pretty easy. A lot of it has to do with the landscape. Okay, let's call it a crime scene, the abduction site. Why would you say white male in his 30s, respectable looking, not threatening in appearance? Because there were no eyewitnesses that come forward and say, oh, I saw this weird guy. I saw this guy that seemed out of place. There was none of that. So what that meant is this guy fits the background. He's not obvious to any eyewitnesses, and he doesn't stand out. He fits the area. He would look like a resident. And on top of that, we know that Alison went with him or got close enough to him that he snatched and grabbed her. Therefore, he cannot be threatening in appearance because she would have never got that close to him or would have never went with him in the first place. He looked the role and didn't put off any alarm bells when she saw him. The other thing here, may have a job that involves being around children. This could be something indirect. And also the thing about some connection to photography. Well, that's part of his ruse. He used photography as part of his ruse. He's going to want to use something that he's fairly comfortable with, or if in fact he did see a picture of her in the newspaper, he knows that his victim is comfortable being photographed, maybe even wants to be photographed. So you could work that either angle, I think. But this is also somebody that knows how to talk to children. And we see this too often when we go through Amy's case. This is something I've always believed, that the individual that spoke to Amy was smart enough in the sense that he could convince her to go somewhere that he wanted. He's setting up the appointment. Meet me here at this time on this day. It's not, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it helps you if you're comfortable speaking with children and if you know how their minds work. We're talking about 10 and 11-year-old individuals here, and we're talking about an adult male offender. So it helps this guy for his game to know how to talk to children, know how to convince his victim how to meet him where he wants to. Maybe a recreational hunter or fisherman. This is basically going to come from where they found the body. Her body was found outdoors in a densely wooded area. I believe it was near a river or stream. So what he's pointing out here is this is somebody that's comfortable with the outdoors. The offender is not going to put himself at more risk than he has to. So just by nature, he's going to pick areas and things that he is more comfortable with. Now, he goes on to say, Douglas goes on to say, the offender knew Alison's name but wouldn't know her address, so he would have to call all of the Parrots in the phone book to track her down. What I like about Douglas's offender profile is he will often, and I know Wrestler did this as well, but Wrestler's a little more reserved with what he puts out there to the public, where Douglas, he always includes strategies for tracking this individual. How would I catch this individual, the offender? So one thing he's telling us is what the crime scene and what the case file tells him is that the offender knew Alison's name but would not have known her address, so he likely had to call all of the Parrots in the phone book until he got to her. Now, we've talked about the problems with tracking that down, especially if Douglas was right saying that it was a local, not somebody from out of town.
Yeah, I mean, again, these local phone calls in 1980s, I mean, they just didn't have the technology. It wasn't a thought to track that kind of stuff. So, I mean, to think that, yeah, it'd be awesome to go back and look at the phone records and say, okay, well, this number's clearly out of the ordinary. They didn't have it. They didn't have a list of numbers. You know, it's
right.
Like the Mihalovic case, you know, they maybe have been a year away from that technology, but in reality, the fact that they can't just pull up a list like you can on your Verizon bill today and see all the phone numbers that you've called and then figure out, oh, well, this number's been called more than another. You know, that aspect of things, it just sucks that the 80s just didn't. I mean, the technology just wasn't there. I mean, it is what it is. But.
Well, and then think about this next little nugget here, because this definitely feeds into Amy's case as well. Remember, now, any profiler will tell you that age is the hardest thing to apply to the profile. And that is based off of the behaviors and the movements and the actions of the offender are based off of their brain, off of their knowledge, off of their life experiences. And we don't all have those same experiences and same knowledge and same life or learning than one another. And one thing that they point out too often is that, especially if somebody has offended before and spends a good deal of time in prison, prison does a certain thing to your brain where it just kind of puts it on ice for a while, where the behaviors of a 45-year-old offender who spent the last 25 years in prison might behave, have movements, and similar modus operandi to somebody that is in their early 20s because they spent so much time in prison. But that being said, I will now say this. Remember, he says early in the profile that it is a white male in his 30s. Okay, so why is he going to choose 30s over 20s? Well, he goes on to clarify. To make the offender believable and to get the victim to agree to meet him at a much less risky location other than her home or school, he would have to have had a convincing and disarming conversational style. Now, this much planning and sophistication pointed to a more mature, intelligent, organized offender. Simply put, he's picking somebody in his 30s rather than 20s because this guy planned and took his time. He wasn't impulsive. He didn't just run up and grab the first girl that he saw, and he didn't make mistakes when talking to her on the phone. Now, people say, how could you know that he didn't make any mistakes, Nick, when he talked to her on the phone? I know he didn't make any mistakes because exactly what he wanted to happen happened. That's plain and simple it. His goal, his result that he was seeking when he phoned Alison Parrott's home, asking for Alison that day, he got the result that he wanted.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom Kearns and I host the Anglo-Saxon England podcast, where I cover the history and culture of England from the departure of the Romans in the 5th century to the Norman conquest in 1066. So far we've surveyed the collapse of Roman rule in Britain, the migration of the Anglo-Saxons, and the history of Northumbria from its beginnings in the mists of legend to its destruction at the hands of Viking raiders in the 9th century. I hope you'll come and give it a go.
Yeah, I mean, the success rate on being able to call somebody once, twice, and then literally be able to lure her, rape her, and then murder her, and then he got away with it for almost 2 decades. Not quite 2 decades, but he got away with it for a decade. And, you know, it's one of those things that's just crazy that, you know, people, I don't know, could take I don't know. It's just.
And listen to this. This has always been kind of your and I, this falls into some theories that you and I have put forth with Amy's case.
Mm-hmm.
So the offender likely used this technique before to get other kids with much less consequence. So there is some speculation whether there were other phone calls involved before Amy was abducted, maybe even afterward. But what we're seeing here and what Douglas is suggesting is that this individual was practicing this technique likely for situations where there's going to be less consequence, meaning he's carrying it a step further every time that he practices this technique, much like Edmund Kemper picking up a hitchhiker and seeing how far they will ride with him. And then the next time he picks them up and takes them to a location other than where they request to go, just to see how that's going to play itself out. Then the third time he picks up a hitchhiker, takes them somewhere where they don't want to go, and now he's got a gun in the car. And then the fourth time it ends in murder and all kinds of other nasty business. So it's practicing the technique, just as any baseball team or football team would do out there. You're seeking a certain result, and you're going to apply different methods. Through trial and error, you're going to figure out what works. So the offender wants to meet Alison at a location that she feels comfortable So he wants to convince her to go willingly to a location, but he also needs to feel comfortable at that location. There's a give and take there, right? There's a give and take
Yeah,
there. Yeah,
absolutely. And he's saying, come to this place. It's similar to the Amy thing. It's a comfortable spot, and you've been here before. Um, you know, looking into the case of, the Alison case, it's, it states that it was about a 20-minute subway ride from her home, but it was the same stadium where she trained, and it was also in the middle of town. So, and in the middle of the day, just like Amy. Very
right.
comfortable, very reassuring. And that's definitely, you mentioned, and earlier when we were talking about how this all occurred, in one of the articles from around that time, they do talk about how a man headphoned 11 days prior to the kidnapping with the same story, but had spoken to a babysitter. But Alison was at camp, so she maybe thought, and apparently she was told about this, so she thought it was, on the up and up, but as she learned, it was not.
Well, and again, similar circumstances where not only did the offender use the phone to connect with his victim, but the victim, through one way or another, it was known after the fact, after the abduction, that we can probably link this abduction to that phone call.
Yeah, it's, the one thing that they talk about in one of those articles that I was reading from, gosh, it had been 1986, and it was from the Chicago Tribune. And it was, I think it was titled, if somebody wants to learn a lot about this case, from what that time was, it was August 3rd, 1986, it was called "The Girl Followed Rules, but Killer Won Game." And in it, they basically talk about how the ruse of taking this is just straight from the article. The ruse of taking sports photos immediately elicited calls to police from mystery fans. And they pointed out that in Lightning, a novel published in 1984, a killer stalks a young female track star and lures them out by saying he is a reporter for a sports magazine and wants to interview them. I just think that's kind of crazy, but they do talk about, in this 1986 article, they have asked John Douglas, a supervisory agent with the FBI and an expert in criminology, or an expert in criminal personality profiles, to examine the case. So it's just crazy to think that, August 3rd, 1986, and, Douglas's name is all over it already. So, just insane.
Well, one thing that's interesting here, I was unaware about that book. You said Lightning is the title?
Yeah, so it's a book by Ed McBain, which sounds like a character. I think McBain is from The Simpsons. That's what I think of. But I remember reading that article, or that little snippet, and apparently that I looked up the book. I tried to find it on Amazon. It seems to be out of print. I think you could probably buy it somewhere, maybe from his website. But yeah, the fact that it actually made people call in and, hey, this sounds really similar to that. It's kind of interesting.
Hang on one second. I want to make a note here.
It says, although police acknowledge they are reading the book, they say that they cannot connect, or they can't comment on a possible connection.
Well, okay, so think about this for a second. There could be no connection at all, but let's do another exercise and entertain this idea. Later, we would learn that the man convicted 10 years later in the Alison Parrott case, we know that he had offended before. He was not a murderer prior to this, as far as we know. But from my understanding, he spent some time being locked up. You wonder, is this a book that he read as a civilian at one point, or is this a book that he read as an inmate and he adapted this method, this technique, and applied it to give it a shot, take it for a test drive, and see how it plays out?
Yeah, and it makes me it does make me wonder as far as, what did he see that could work? I mean, was that something that he thought, okay, well, this is a story that would put her at ease? Because, I mean, you look at the Mahalovic case, he used her mom as the, basically the reassurance of, this is going to be fine. I work with your mom. Again, is it possible that Amy's killer read about Alison's killer or Alison's murder, and you can all basically connect it back to that book? But I don't know. It'd be interesting.
It's not. I don't think that it's out of the realm of possibility. I've gone through interviews with serial killers, and a lot of them, I shouldn't say a lot of them, but several of them have said, you collected baseball cards when you were a kid, and you reviewed the stats, and you knew the stats of your favorite players. I was reading about serial killers and learning from what worked for them and what didn't work for them. And on that same thought, if somebody did study or was aware of Alison Parrott's case in 1989 or before then and chose to use a similar technique and ruse, why not pick this one? The offender at the time of Alison's case had not been detected and caught and convicted. That's the result you want, right?
That's a fabulous point, because at that time, you're right, he wasn't convicted and he was still on the loose and, probably committing crimes as well. I mean, it's just, I guess to somebody that could just be like the perfect setup. And I don't know if you have to have a real deep knowledge of phone tracing or phone technology in 1989 to know that they don't trace your phone calls, but
or use a payphone. I mean, there were a bazillion of them,
right? Exactly.
And one thing I do want to,
who don't know what a payphone is, you actually put money into this thing that was on a corner, and there were telephones that you actually put money in, and you would make phone calls, but they don't exist anymore now that we have cell phones.
Yeah, and one thing I want to point out here too with Amy's case, there are a couple things that we do know that happened, and I find it to be very interesting. And I feel like we should contact Ma Bell and find out what we can find out. This is, if anybody wants to do this homework out there or knows how to do this type of homework, please do it and let Bill and I know. But we know that Amy was about what time Amy was picked up. We also have a very general idea of when she called her mother at work. So if in fact this offender Amy's killer chose to use a payphone to lessen his risk of getting caught when calling Amy, he very likely would have chose a payphone again to have Amy call her mother at work. There was not a lot of time that passed between her abduction when she left with the individual in the vehicle and when that phone call came in. And I think, and I'm basing this a lot off of a couple of timelines that I've seen. Most of them have Amy being greeted by a man around 2:45 p.m. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bill. So let's say 2:45 to 2:50 p.m. ish. Does that sound right?
Yeah. Let me give you an exact. It was actually, let's see.
If you would have asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have known.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it was right around that time. It was between 2:45 and 3:15, basically. But it was 3:15 that Jason basically raises the alarm that, um, you know, he called. That's when he called his mom to say that she hadn't returned home. So, yeah, the assumption is that she was probably taken between 2:45 and 3 o'clock.
So, yeah, just going off of memory, I couldn't remember if 2:45 was the estimated arrival time at the plaza, because we do know a few minutes expired before the offender approached Amy. But even if I'm off a little bit on that time, the fascinating thing to me is shortly after Jason tells Margaret that Amy's not home, Margaret's words are that shortly after, we don't know what shortly exactly means, but
3:30 is what I've got.
Is the general thought. Okay,
Is
so
when she got the phone call. Yeah.
So you figure that's traffic, all that. It'd be interesting to draw a radius, approximate drive time radius around Bay Village Shopping Plaza, because we know that call had to occur within inside that circle. That's just would be something that would be interesting to view and to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely could look at, I know pretty much all the gas stations and, all those convenience stores. They pretty much all had payphones. So, the idea that he would have used one that would have been, let's just say, I don't know, a half mile away, that's completely plausible.
Yeah. But it would tell us.
But she's not worried yet. You know what I mean? Like, she's still under the idea that it's all good.
Well, again, we have to believe that call too was local. So we can go ahead and eliminate anything outside of the area code from where Margaret worked. But inside that big area, which is the area code, we could probably eliminate portions of that area code just based off of general drive time and say, even at the very latest, we got, and this seems very, very longer than it needs to be, but even at the latest, 40 minutes drive time?
Down to Ashland?
No, I just mean between the time that we know that it's believed that the offender approached her to likely when the phone call came in.
Yeah, let's just say that she got picked up at 3:00. 30 minutes. Gosh, but it only takes about 15, 20 minutes to get out of Bay. If you're heading south, it takes 5 minutes to get out of Bay, or not even. You've been to the Moosehead Saloon, which is literally right across the street, or right across the railroad tracks from Bay, which is only a half mile from where Amy was taken. So it would have been 2-3 minutes before she would have been out of the city.
It could eliminate some of the corners, though, I'm saying, of that area code. Some of the ones that are further away. Anyway, sorry, you know me, I get sidetracked with these things.
It always. It's a rabbit hole.
So, continuing on, there's some other interesting things in Douglas's profile. Vehicle type: a commercial style van with not many windows. The sexual assault would take place inside his vehicle. He did not intend to kill Alison. Killing was not a part of his plan or his thinking. The offender developed a fantasy of a real relationship between him and the attractive, what he perceived to be attractive, prepubescent girl. This fantasy would have been solidified in his mind by her willingness to get in the vehicle, meaning he's got this fantasy that somehow they're going to meet and they're going to fall in love, or that she's going to find him attractive. And the only confirmation he needs of this is her willingness to get in the vehicle. That's him going, okay, she likes me. We can carry this a step further in the direction that he wants it to go. Now, when they get to the location where he feels comfortable. So he's trying to get the victim into his vehicle and then take her somewhere where he feels comfortable. This is going to be a more isolated area. This is going to be away from any eyes or ears that might hear or see what's going on. He makes a sexual advance and expects her to react the way that a consenting adult woman would. But instead, she's 11. He's a 30-year-old monster. She reacts the way that any terrified little girl would and rejects him. This would be crying, yelling, screaming. She wants to go home. She doesn't want to be with this guy. And now he has lost total control of the situation. He's not getting what he wants from the situation, but he can't let her go. This is why Douglas says he didn't plan to kill the victim. He thought that if I get there and at the meeting place and she decides not to go with me, no harm, no foul, I'll just try again later. If she does go with me, I'm going to take it a step further. Her willingness to get into the vehicle confirms in my sick brain that she wants to be with me. And then when she behaves the way that we would expect an 11-year-old girl to behave, he's then reminded, shit, this is an 11-year-old girl. I called her at her house. I asked her to get in my vehicle. I took her to this isolated area. I can't just let her go now because I've already committed all kinds of crimes. And so he's going to react the only way that he knows how, and this is going to turn into him trying to control the situation, her fighting back. This all because she can identify him. You know, she's going to be able to provide some information to the authorities about his vehicle, about him, about things that he told her, what he looks like. They will probably be able to track this guy down.
Yeah, I mean, you look at what that profile is similar to, they all sound so similar to what the Mahalovic case is, 30s, average, You want
to hear some more similarities?
Sure.
Okay. Placement of the body. He would be a local in this place he would not only be familiar with, but comfortable with. This place was chosen because he would know what to expect while he's there with the victim and placing the body, and know what he wouldn't be, and know that he would not be interrupted. The body is lying on the ground, placed, not tossed in the river, not buried and not thrown away like garbage. On some level, he wants her body to be found. He wants her to be taken care of in death and have a proper burial. This goes back to the thought that he was fantasizing about the victim and developed some type of emotional connection to her, even though it's only in his own mind. After the murder, he does not feel good about himself for what happened. He feels inadequate. He will not plan to kill again, but will always be capable of murdering again.
Yeah, so I just want to give you, so I've got a profile. So back in 1999, Cleveland Magazine did a 10-year retrospective on the Amy Mahalovic case. And it's one of the better articles ever done on the case. It's really, really, really well done.
Is it just titled Amy Mahalovic, or what is it
it's
titled?
Called Who Killed Amy?
Okay, and I've read that, but it's been years ago. And you're right, it is fantastic.
It is fantastic. It's the most detailed version of what's going on during that day. At that time, Renner's obviously gone into greater detail, but in this report, in this story, they talked to, I believe it's Stephen Etter and Wayne Lord, who are both profilers, to give it the simplest name. But this is what they talk about with Ashland. They go, this is what Wayne Lord said. He said, Lord explains that the Ashland County location is just as important. This was not random. When you are disposing of something that could ruin your entire life, you're going to be careful. And so this unknown male knew County Road 1181. He knew that he could quickly place Amy's body just over a shallow ridge a few yards from the pavement and expect it would go undiscovered for a few weeks or a few months. And that's just so similar.
But not buried, not tossed in the river, not thrown away, placed. like placed, not like placed. Thrown away like trash.
Covered up for the most likely with the fact that they found the blanket and the curtain. I mean, my assumption is, and I could be, but my theory goes is that she was wrapped in those things, and just with the fact that area is such a, it's basically like a wind. You don't want to be running down that street. Let's just put it that way. It's open field and very windy, especially in the wintertime. So I think she was originally covered and those blew away. That's my thought. And I think that's why she wasn't discovered so quickly. And, you do go back. I mean, you look at Alison's case and you say, okay, and the Douglas profile about not wanting, kind of wanting her to be found, but not, you don't want to get caught for it. Like they don't feel that bad about it. They feel a closeness with their victim that they want there to be. Maybe they wanted it to be in the news. Maybe they want the recognition that the body's been found, because a lot of people could, like they say about Amy's case, and I think you brought it up in your podcast, they didn't just, if he wanted to, he could have walked a quarter mile further into that field, dug a hole, and we maybe never have found her.
We would have never found her if that would have happened.
No. I mean, there were plenty of places in that location where her body was found, which was, again, in the middle of for people who are familiar with the state of Ohio, basically in between Columbus and Cleveland, but in one of the most rural and desolate areas. And so we're talking farmland, fields, just very, 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 very few people. And, like they say, it's just not random. And I think with, Alison's case, where was her body? Her body was found near the stadium though, wasn't it?
This was found dead 2 evenings later in a densely wooded area of Kings Mill Park on the Humber River, just below the Old Mill subway station. So
probably someplace that he had been before.
I don't know the distance between the abduction site and the dump site, but Douglas pointing out that the body was near enough the river that the river could have been a very likely option for the offender, but he chose to, for whatever reason, whether it was something he thought about or didn't even think about, he chose not to use the river. And a lot of times too, what these profilers will tell us is the amount of effort that one goes to hide a body often reflects their connection, or their strong connection, or their no connection to the victim, where they will say that if somebody just places a body or throws a body out of a car on the side of the road, they usually are doing that because they have very little to no connection with the victim. Where an offender, as you mentioned, if it was a neighbor, if the victim was a neighbor of the offender or a niece or a brother or whatever, the wife, the closer the connection between a victim and offender, the greater lengths that the offender will go to hide the body. Because especially back in the day when you had states that weren't convicting people of murder if they couldn't find the body, you could say all night and day that some guy killed his wife because he's the only likely suspect. But back then, if you had no body, you couldn't even bring it to court. So it's just that very general thought and feel that given the opportunity, that's the thing we have to keep in mind though too. Given the opportunity, most offenders will choose to further conceal the body if they know or if they're close to the victim. Again, both of these situations, Alison's case and Amy's case, just kind of placed out there, easy to find. Again, going back to the thought that the offender in Amy's case may not have had any connection to her at all, other than he knew her name and what she looked like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there's definitely, they like to emphasize the fact that he had to have had some knowledge of the family, and there had to be some personal knowledge. How much that is, I don't know. I mean, I think you could pick up a lot of information, if it was 2019 like it is now, you could go on their Instagram and find out exactly who they are, what they're doing. But 1989, you got to figure that the guy who saw Amy had to have been familiar with the area. I mean, had to frequent the area. In that article, they do talk about, they quote, that we have reason to believe that he knew this area. Maybe he was a resident or a contract worker or delivery person familiar with Bay Square. So, it does, but how would he know Amy? If he was just a delivery person. That's my thought. I get the Parrott case because of the fact that she was in the paper, and I know that, pictures are pictures and whatever, but if we want to go way deep into your theory, I mean, pictures come back on your theories and about the Mahalovic case. So, we can open that rabbit hole someday again, but that one's a whole, that's a great theory. The one thing about what's that?
Well, I'm just going through Douglas's suggestions and strategies for finding Alison's killer. Authorities should publicly humanize and personalize the victim as much as possible. The offender has done his best to depersonalize her after the fact. Publicly discuss her life's moments and accomplishments using the newspapers and TV coverage. Hold a very public memorial at the body dump location. Hold a very public memorial at the abduction location. Here's one that I find incredibly interesting because, listen to this. You might not make the connection right away, but I love, and I know this is very Hollywood, cat and mouse, FBI investigators, detectives versus serial killer or one-time offender, what have you. Mm-hmm. Plant a seed of doubt in the offender's mind by having police announce that a mysterious vehicle matching his, in this case we suspect a van, Alison's case, was seen near the abduction or dump site, and anyone with information regarding this vehicle should contact police. Amy's case, didn't we have a woman? We had a woman that came forward, months and months later, saying, I saw a suspicious hatchback with a man standing near the open hatchback of this vehicle around 6 p.m. the night before her body was found, with a vague description of the vehicle. And do we got that tipster's name? Because I'm starting to wonder, did they use this technique in Amy's case?
Yeah, I wonder about that. That's an interesting that's interesting.
So this technique, I've seen this used often in other cases, especially ones that Douglas has worked. And the reason why they do this is there's a belief, there's a certain percentage belief that the offender himself will come forward and present himself either as somebody that witnessed that vehicle there. So now they're not in the offender role in law enforcement's mind, they're in the witness role, or they will come forward to explain away why their vehicle may have been in the area at the time. It wouldn't be the first time that they shook the trees and the offender fell out using this technique.
Yeah, let's see.
Damn it.
Yeah, I don't know the guy's name, but I do know that the sketch of the individual, because she did say that she saw the individual with over the hatchback. They put out a sketch and it looks nothing like the original sketches. Now, granted, Spetzel has made sure to say don't put too much emphasis on those sketches. But if I was to be honest with you, it looks a lot like the recent Delphi sketch.
Yeah.
I'll send you a picture. Do you have it? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, we actually spoke about it when we covered Amy's case a couple weeks ago.
Okay. Yeah, it's such a different picture. It's just, But yeah, that is interesting to think that they would be putting misinformation out there. But that's their job. I mean, I think their job is to catch the killer whatever way they go about doing it. As far as legally speaking, I mean, there's nothing illegal about saying something like that. I mean, they're even allowed to lie to you when you're in custody, as far as like, we have evidence that proves you did this, even though they don't. They can still do that, and it's legal. Let's not get into the morality of that, but it's not unusual for lies to be used to somehow get to the truth.
Well, and when you're convicted by a jury of your peers or facing trial by a jury of your peers and you killed a child, no one gives a shit how what ruse you fell for. When to walk yourself into the police station and explain away your van that was seen near an abduction site, nor should they.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I mean, I just, as far, this is from Renner.
Well, ignore that and listen to this. This is what we were talking about earlier with Amy's case, especially with the 30-year anniversary of the abduction upon us, as well as the her body being found date as well. Douglas suggests to target anniversaries of the abduction, the body being found, and victims' birthdays to remind him, the offender, and to remind the offender of his victim, and that the public and the authorities are still looking for the killer. Yeah. That's just keeping the pressure on. That's just turning up the heat a little bit. And that's an attempt to scare the offender into making a mistake or doing something stupid, even all these years later.
Yeah, I think that the more pressure, the more attention, we're getting to it 30 years. I mean, obviously the time to solve the case is now, but let's just continue to keep the case in the spotlight, and the pressure should still be on the killer, because, I mean, he's the one that's walking around with the burden of murdering a young girl. And the day that there is justice, or there is some sort of resolution in the case, I mean, it'll be great. I mean, it doesn't bring Amy back and doesn't bring closure to her family, but it can close a chapter, at least in a lot of people's worlds, and the community, as far as knowing that this perpetrator is, off the street. But I don't know, man. 30 years.
Of course, we do know that Alison Perot's killer was eventually caught due to a DNA match, and the offender was Francis Carl Roy. and he was convicted about 10 years later. And I'm going to leave you on your own to discuss the details of that trial and the defense involved in that, if you wish.
Yeah, he's a character, that's for sure. And I believe this is the guy who says that he just stumbled across the body, right?
You're not going to make me say it, are you?
Okay, all right. I'll do it. I'll discuss the.
You'll do it on your own. You got to tell them how it ends.
I will.
It's
I'm guessing that
most absurd defense you've ever heard in your life. When you hear the defense that he puts forward to suggest his innocence, that's when I say we should probably lock this guy up anyway. Even if he didn't kill the girl, we need to lock this individual up. So I'll let you go through those horrible
details.
What he claims to be.
Yeah, I can cover the nitty gritty on that, but I'm guessing that you got a roll.
I am. I got the 10 to 15 minutes out warning.
Okay. All right. Well, I do appreciate you joining me again, Nick, and your insight into the Mahalovic case, and obviously bringing this case from Toronto to my attention was intriguing, and I hope the listeners will see the parallels. And again, this guy wasn't caught when Amy was abducted, but I mean Alison's killer was eventually caught, so it's not to say that he has anything to do with Amy's killer. It's just the similarities and the idea that Amy's killer could have learned from this case, because it was the 80s and everybody was very familiar with stranger danger and missing children. So if you had a propensity or an interest in children, this would have been a good example for how to get one or lure one.
Or could have learned from the same book. As ironic as that might be, both of them could have learned from the same book. So
True.
All right, Bill. Well, I do appreciate you having me on, and it's always fun talking with you. Let's do it again soon.
Awesome. I appreciate it, Nick. And thanks again. And go get your refrigerator fixed.
All right. Take care.
All right, man. Thanks a lot. Take it easy. I'll talk to you soon.
Yep.
Thanks again to Nick for joining me on this week's episode of Who Killed Amy Mahalovic. Unfortunately, we have run out of time on this week's episode to discuss the details of the trial, but we will get there next week. So thank you again for listening, and if you enjoy this independently produced podcast, please help support the show by clicking on the donate button on the bottom left of whokilledamymahalovic.com or via the Venmo app with my username @BillHuffman3. Any amount is appreciated, and it helps keep the podcast running. If you enjoy this show, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts, because this will help support the show and help keep Amy's story in the spotlight. You can contact the Bay Village Police Department at 440-871-1234 if you have any new information regarding this case. The FBI is offering a reward of up to $25,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible for the death of Amy Renee Mahalovic. So anyone with information concerning this case, please contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. Thank you again for listening, and be safe.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom Kearns and I host the Anglo-Saxon England podcast, where I cover the history and culture of England from the departure of the Romans in the 5th century to the Norman conquest in 1066. So far we've surveyed the collapse of Roman rule in Britain, the migration of the Anglo-Saxons, and the history of Northumbria from its beginnings in the mists of legend to its destruction at the hands of Viking raiders in the 9th century. I hope you'll come and give it a go.
Coming up on 5 Minute News, I'm Anthony Davis. You might think it's partisan because maybe it's critical of one side or the other, but it's not, it's just the truth. And I think that's also something that's kind of unusual for Americans listening to the radio or to podcasts, because the news landscape in the States has been so partisan for so many decades. So 5 Minute News is verified, truthful, independent, unbiased, and essential world news daily.